December 18th, 1940, Wolfschanze, East Prussia. The map room. Generaloberst Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, stood before a massive map of the Soviet Union, his pointer tracing the routes Napoleon's Grande Armée had taken 128 years earlier. Around the table sat the architects of Germany's planned invasion, General Feldmarschall Walter von Brauchitsch, Generaloberst Friedrich Paulus, and a dozen senior staff officers tasked with planning Operation Barbarossa. Napoleon's failure teaches us everything we need to know. Halder addressed his audience with professorial confidence. He advanced too far, too fast, without adequate logistics. His supply line stretched beyond sustainability. Winter caught him unprepared. The Russian vastness swallowed his army. Halder's pointer moved across the map, indicating the proposed invasion routes. We will not repeat these errors. Our logistics are mechanized, not horse-drawn like Napoleon's. Our operational depth is calculated precisely. We will complete the campaign before winter. The Red Army, primitive and poorly led, will collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. The gathered officers nodded in agreement. Germany's military machine had conquered Poland in 26 days, Denmark in 6 hours, Norway in 2 months, France in 6 weeks. Soviet Russia, ravaged by Stalin's purges, equipped with obsolete weapons, dependent on primitive logistics, would fall even faster. The lessons of Napoleon's failure had been learned. Germany would succeed where the emperor had failed. What Halder didn't know, what none of the German high command could have anticipated, was that within 18 months, American factories would begin delivering hundreds of thousands of trucks to the Soviet Union. These vehicles, rugged, reliable, standardized, would transform Soviet logistics from horse-drawn primitiveness into mechanized mobility exceeding Germany's own capabilities. The Red Army that German planners dismissed as hopelessly backward would achieve operational mobility Napoleon's Grande Armée could never have imagined, supplied by American trucks arriving at rates Germany couldn't match or interdict. The meticulous German planning that accounted for Napoleon's failures would prove catastrophically incomplete. The generals who studied 19th century logistics failed to anticipate 20th century American industrial production pouring into Russia through routes beyond German reach. The Soviet Union that seemed isolated and vulnerable would receive 400,000 trucks, 1,900 locomotives, 11,000 rail cars, and millions of tons of supplies that would enable the very mobility and logistics Napoleon had lacked. This story is about how historical precedent blinded German planning to industrial reality, how confidence in learning from the past prevented recognition of changing present circumstances, and how American productive capacity transformed Soviet weakness into strength that German strategists never anticipated. The lessons of 1812 proved worthless against the realities of 1943. The German General Staff's confidence in Operation Barbarossa rested on extensive historical analysis. Following Hitler's directive on December 18, 1940, to plan the Soviet invasion, Halder's staff conducted exhaustive studies of previous campaigns in Russia. Napoleon's 1812 disaster received particular attention as the most recent example of invasion failure. Major Reinhard Gehlen, heading the Foreign Army's East Intelligence Section, prepared comprehensive analyses of Napoleon's mistakes. His reports, circulated among the planning staff, identified clear lessons. Napoleon had advanced 500 miles from the border to Moscow, with supply lines stretching impossibly thin. His army consumed supplies faster than horse-drawn wagons could deliver them. The Russian policy of withdrawing, while destroying resources, denied the French army the ability to live off the land. Winter arrived with French forces still deep in Russian territory, inadequately supplied and sheltered. German planning would avoid these errors through mechanization and speed. The Wehrmacht possessed 3,350 tanks, 7,100 artillery pieces, and 600,000 motorized vehicles. This mechanized force would advance faster than Napoleon's army, complete the campaign before winter, and rely on truck transport rather than horses for logistics. The plan called for 3 army groups, totaling 3.8 million men, to advance along axes toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. The campaign would last 8 to 10 weeks. Soviet resistance would collapse under overwhelming force applied with unprecedented speed. By autumn 1941, German forces would occupy Russia west of the Urals, and the war would be won. Soviet military capabilities seemed to confirm German optimism. Stalin's purges of 1937-1938 had decimated Red Army leadership. Of 767 senior officers, 512 were executed or imprisoned. 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 110 of 195 division commanders had been eliminated. The surviving officers were politically reliable, but often militarily incompetent. Soviet equipment appeared obsolete. Intelligence reports noted that Red Army logistics relied primarily on horses. Of approximately 600,000 vehicles in Soviet military inventory, most were in poor condition with limited spare parts. Soviet truck production totaled about 145,000 vehicles annually, barely adequate to replace losses without expanding capability. German assessments calculated that Soviet logistics could support only limited operational mobility. The Red Army could defend, but lacked the transport to conduct sustained offensive operations or rapid redeployment. This apparent weakness reinforced German confidence. The Soviets couldn't maneuver effectively, even if they survived the initial onslaught. What German intelligence completely missed was a diplomatic development occurring 5,000 miles from Moscow. On March 11, 1941, 3 months before Barbarossa began, the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, authorizing President Roosevelt to provide military equipment to nations fighting the Axis. While initially focused on Britain, the legislation included provisions that could extend to the Soviet Union if Hitler attacked. German intelligence dismissed Lend-Lease as strategically insignificant. Even if America supplied the Soviets, shipping routes would be vulnerable. The northern route through Murmansk faced German air and naval interdiction. The Persian corridor through Iran required building infrastructure that would take years. The Pacific route through Vladivostok was politically complicated by Soviet neutrality with Japan. American supplies couldn't reach Russia in meaningful quantities soon enough to affect the campaign. Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, with the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German and Axis troops, organized in 152 divisions, crossed the Soviet border along a 1,800-mile front. The initial advances exceeded even optimistic projections. Army Group North, under General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, advanced toward Leningrad, covering 450 miles in 3 weeks. Army Group Center, commanded by General Feldmarschall Fedor von Bock, encircled Soviet forces at Minsk and Smolensk, capturing 600,000 prisoners by mid-July. Army Group South, under General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, drove into Ukraine, approaching Kiev by August. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, commanding Panzer Group II in Army Group Center, described the early campaign in his war diary. The Russians fight with desperate courage but show little tactical sophistication. More critically, their logistics appear completely inadequate. We repeatedly outmaneuver Soviet forces that lack the mobility to respond. Their counterattacks are slow, predictable, poorly coordinated. They cannot concentrate force quickly. This will be over by autumn. The Soviet logistics situation indeed appeared catastrophic. Red Army units often moved on foot, supported by horse-drawn wagons. Soviet truck transport, inadequate before the war, had been devastated by German air attacks and encirclement battles. By September 1941, the Red Army had lost over 200,000 vehicles, more than Soviet industry could produce in a year. German confidence seemed justified by early October 1941, when Operation Typhoon, the drive toward Moscow, encircled another 650,000 Soviet troops near Vyazma. German forces approached within 65 miles of Moscow. Stalin ordered government evacuation to Kuibyshev. Soviet resistance appeared on the verge of collapse, but something unexpected was occurring beyond German observation. On October 1, 1941, the first convoy of American trucks arrived at the Soviet Pacific port of Vladivostok. The shipment included 1,500 Studebaker US6 2.5-ton trucks, the first installment of what would become a flood of American vehicles transforming Soviet logistics. The Studebaker US6, designed specifically for Lend-Lease export, embodied American industrial pragmatism. The 6x6 truck featured all-wheel drive, robust construction, and legendary reliability. It could carry 2.5 tons on roads or 5 tons cross-country. The 90-horsepower Hercules engine provided adequate power while maintaining simplicity for field maintenance. The truck could operate in temperatures from 40 degrees to 120 degrees Celsius without modification. More importantly, the US6 was designed for mass production. Studebaker's South Bend, Indiana factory could produce 200 trucks daily using standardized components. Every US6 was identical, same engine, same transmission, same axles. This standardization meant that Soviet mechanics needed to learn maintenance on only one truck type. Spare parts were completely interchangeable, and logistics planning could rely on known capabilities. Soviet response to the American trucks was immediate and enthusiastic. The Studebaker US6 exceeded Soviet GAZ and ZIS trucks in every performance category while requiring less maintenance. Unlike Soviet vehicles that needed constant adjustment and repair, the American trucks simply worked. Soviet drivers called them Studers and treated them as treasured equipment. General Georgy Zhukov, commanding the defense of Moscow in December 1941, received his first allocation of 500 American trucks in November. He immediately recognized their significance. In his post-war memoirs, Zhukov wrote, "The American trucks began arriving just as we needed mobility to respond to German thrusts. These vehicles allowed us to move reserves faster than we ever could with horse transport. The Germans still believed we were logistically primitive. The American trucks were beginning to change that reality." Through late 1941 and early 1942, American truck deliveries accelerated. The Vladivostok route proved surprisingly effective. Soviet-Japanese neutrality allowed ships to transit the Pacific unmolested. The 5,000-mile voyage from American West Coast ports to Vladivostok took 18 to 20 days. From Vladivostok, trucks could be driven west along the Trans-Siberian Railway route, though initially most were deployed in Far East military districts as reserve forces. The northern route through Murmansk opened despite German air attacks. Arctic convoys, braving U-boats, and Luftwaffe bombers delivered trucks along with tanks, aircraft, and other supplies. The convoy system proved more resilient than Germans anticipated. Of 801 ships in 78 convoys to Murmansk between 1941 and 1945, only 58 were sunk, a loss rate of 7.2%. The Persian corridor route required massive infrastructure development. American and British engineers built ports, roads, and railways through Iran, creating a supply line from the Persian Gulf to Soviet Central Asia. By late 1942, this route was delivering thousands of trucks monthly, beyond any German ability to interdict. German intelligence detected increasing American supply activity, but underestimated its impact. Oberst Reinhard Gehlen's Foreign Armies East Section noted American truck deliveries in January 1942 intelligence summaries but dismissed their significance. American vehicle deliveries totaling approximately 5,000 trucks monthly cannot materially affect Soviet logistics given the vast distances and enormous Soviet transport requirements. The deliveries represent propaganda value more than military significance. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. By December 1942, American truck deliveries exceeded 10,000 monthly. The cumulative effect was transforming Soviet operational capabilities in ways German planners never anticipated. The turning point came during the Soviet Winter Offensive of 1942-1943, specifically during Operation Little Saturn, the drive to cut off German forces attempting to relieve Stalingrad. The operation demonstrated how American trucks had revolutionized Soviet mobility. On December 16, 1942, Soviet Southwest Front under General Nikolai Vatutin launched attacks toward Morozovsk and Tatsinskaya, aiming to cut rail lines supplying German forces in the Stalingrad pocket. The operation required rapid concentration of forces, movement across winter terrain, and sustained offensive operations, tasks that had been impossible for Soviet forces the previous year. General Lieutenant Wolfgang Pickert, commanding the 9th Flak Division at Tatsinskaya, witnessed Soviet operational mobility that shattered previous assumptions. His post-battle report to Luftwaffe Command described his shock. Soviet mechanized columns appeared with startling speed from unexpected directions. Their mobility exceeded anything we observed in 1941. Tank brigades, supported by motorized infantry, advanced 50 kilometers daily through winter conditions. Their logistics were adequate to sustain offensive operations continuously. Most disturbing was observing their truck columns, endless streams of identical vehicles, clearly American-made. These trucks moved troops, towed artillery, carried ammunition and fuel. The primitive, horse-drawn logistics we encountered in 1941 had been replaced by mechanization rivaling our own. Pickert's forces evacuated Tatsinskaya airfield under direct Soviet attack, abandoning critical transport aircraft supporting the Stalingrad garrison. The speed of Soviet advance enabled by truck mobility had prevented orderly withdrawal. German troops, accustomed to outmaneuvering slower Soviet forces, found themselves being outmaneuvered. The pattern repeated across the front. Soviet forces demonstrated mobility impossible without motorized transport. Reinforcements arrived faster than German intelligence predicted. Soviet reserves appeared at critical points with timing that suggested efficient transportation networks. The Red Army was no longer the logistically limited force of 1941. Generaloberst Kurt Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as Chief of the General Staff in September 1942, received increasing reports of Soviet mobility. His January 1943 situation assessment noted, "Enemy maneuver capability has increased substantially. Soviet forces demonstrate ability to concentrate and redeploy with speed, approaching our own mechanized units. This represents a significant change from 1941-42 Soviet performance." What Zeitzler's assessment didn't fully grasp was the scale of American support. By January 1943, the United States had delivered over 90,000 trucks to the Soviet Union. Soviet industry, relocated east of the Urals and recovering from 1941 losses, was producing another 120,000 vehicles annually. Combined Soviet-American truck production totaled over 200,000 vehicles in 1943, more than Germany produced for all armed forces combined. The Studebaker US6 became ubiquitous in Soviet service. By mid-1943, every Soviet tank army, mechanized corps, and rifle corps included American trucks in substantial numbers. The typical Soviet rifle division, which had relied primarily on horse transport in 1941, now operated with 500-600 trucks, many of them American. Mechanized and tank corps operated almost entirely on American vehicles for their logistics elements. The trucks enabled Soviet operational doctrine to evolve. Deep operations, the pre-war Soviet theory of achieving breakthrough followed by exploitation into enemy rear areas, had failed in 1941 because Soviet forces lacked the mobility to sustain advances. By 1943, American trucks provided the logistics tail that made deep operations feasible. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated this transformation conclusively. The operation became the largest tank battle in history, but the decisive factor was logistics. Soviet forces, supplied by tens of thousands of American trucks, maintained ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to 6 defensive lines and multiple operational reserves. General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, described the logistical dimensions in his post-war memoirs. "We expected Soviet defenses to weaken as our offensive penetrated deeper, their logistics unable to sustain resistance. Instead, they reinforced constantly. Ammunition never seemed to run short. Fuel arrived for their counterattacks. Reserves appeared from nowhere. Our intelligence had drastically underestimated Soviet logistics capability. They were moving and supplying forces with efficiency exceeding our own, Only later did we understand the American trucks had transformed their system completely. The Soviet counteroffensive following Kursk revealed the full extent of logistics transformation. Soviet forces advanced 1,200 miles from Kursk to the Dnieper River between July and December 1943, sustaining offensive operations across the entire southern front. This operational tempo would have been impossible without mechanized logistics. German commanders noted Soviet truck columns with growing concern. Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrici, commanding 4th Army, reported in August 1943, "Enemy logistics appear superior to our own. Their truck transport is more reliable, more numerous, and better maintained. We struggle with vehicle breakdowns and spare parts shortages. They seem to have unlimited transport capacity. Our assumption of Soviet logistical weakness has proven completely incorrect." The statistics told a stark story. By December 1943, American deliveries to the Soviet Union totaled 151,053 trucks, 5,000 tractor units, 5,071 motorcycles, 1,181 locomotives, 11,055 railway cars. German production for all Wehrmacht needs in 1943, 89,151 trucks, 1,289 locomotives, limited railcar production. The Soviet Union was receiving American trucks at nearly twice the rate Germany could produce vehicles for its entire military, while simultaneously maintaining its own domestic production. This logistics imbalance proved as decisive as any weapons system. The operational implications extended beyond simple mobility. American trucks enabled Soviet artillery to achieve unprecedented effectiveness. The Red Army's artillery arm, always numerous, had been limited by inability to move and resupply guns quickly. American trucks solved both problems. The typical Soviet artillery division in 1943 operated with 600-800 American trucks, providing ammunition transport. This mobility allowed Soviet artillery to concentrate overwhelming firepower rapidly, then displace to avoid counter-battery fire. The devastating artillery barrages that preceded Soviet offensives from 1943 onward, sometimes involving 250-300 guns per kilometer of front, were only possible because American trucks delivered the ammunition. The Katyusha rocket launcher battalions, terror weapons that German troops called Stalin's organs, relied almost exclusively on American trucks. The BM-13 launcher was mounted on Studebaker US6 chassis, providing mobility to fire, displace, and reload rapidly. Without American trucks, these weapons would have been far less effective. Soviet supply operations achieved efficiency that German logistics could no longer match. The Red Army's logistics system, primitive and inefficient in 1941, had been rebuilt around American truck transport. Supply depots were organized for truck loading. Road networks were prioritized for maintenance. Driver training programs focused on the Studebaker US6. The entire system was optimized around American vehicle characteristics. By 1944, the logistics imbalance had become catastrophic for Germany. Soviet forces conducted the Bagration Offensive, the destruction of Army Group Center, with operational mobility that German forces couldn't counter. Soviet tank armies advanced 400 miles in 5 weeks, supplied by logistics trains consisting primarily of American trucks. Generaloberst Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding 3rd Panzer Army during Bagration, witnessed the collapse. "We were simply overwhelmed by Soviet mobility. Their spearheads advanced faster than we could retreat. Our vehicles broke down constantly. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition supplies were irregular. The Soviets seemed to have unlimited transport capacity. Every time we established a defensive line, they appeared in our rear with forces we couldn't understand how they'd supplied. The logistics war was lost." The final year of the war saw American truck deliveries reach peak levels. In 1944 alone, the United States delivered 154,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, more than the entire Wehrmacht vehicle inventory. Soviet offensives from 1944-45, the liberation of Ukraine, the Balkans campaign, the Vistula Oder operation, and finally the Battle of Berlin, all relied on American truck transport for logistics. By war's end, American Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union totaled 49,526 trucks, 32,200 motorcycles, 5,000 tractors, 8,071 tractors, 1,181 locomotives, 1,155 railway cars, 540,000 tons of rails, 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, and 4.5 million tons of food. The trucks alone, 409,526 vehicles, exceeded the entire Wehrmacht motor vehicle inventory at any single point during the war. This American logistics support transformed Soviet operational capabilities from the horse-drawn primitiveness of 1941 into mechanized mobility that surpassed German forces by 1944. The post-war reckoning for German generals involved confronting how completely they had misjudged the logistics equation. General Oberst Franz Halder, who had confidently explained Germany's advantages over Napoleon in December 1940, faced Allied interrogators in 1945 with a very different assessment. "We studied Napoleon's failure extensively," Halder admitted during interrogation at the Nuremberg trials. "We understood that logistics had defeated him, the inability to supply forces across vast Russian distances. We believed mechanization solved this problem. Our trucks would provide the mobility Napoleon lacked." "What we failed to anticipate," Halder continued, "was that American industrial capacity would provide the Soviets with logistics superior to our own. We expected to face a primitive enemy dependent on horses. By 1943, they had more trucks than we did, and better trucks. The American Studebaker proved more reliable than our own vehicles." The interrogator pressed, "When did you realize American aid was affecting Soviet capabilities?" "Reports began arriving in late 1942 noting Soviet truck columns," Halder recalled. "Initially, we dismissed them as captured equipment or limited aid. By mid-1943, the evidence was overwhelming. Soviet logistics had been revolutionized by American trucks, but by then, the strategic situation had shifted beyond recovery." General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, considered Germany's most capable operational commander, addressed the logistics failure more comprehensively in his 1955 memoir, Lost Victories. "The great irony of Operation Barbarossa is that we prepared so carefully to avoid Napoleon's mistakes while remaining blind to the changing nature of 20th century warfare. We focused on operational planning, force disposition, and campaign timing. We assumed the Soviets would fight with the resources they possessed in June 1941. We failed to account for American industrial intervention on a scale that transformed Soviet capabilities fundamentally. The trucks, hundreds of thousands of American trucks, gave the Red Army operational mobility we could never match with our overstretched logistics. In 1941, we advanced while Soviets struggled to respond, limited by horse-drawn transport. By 1943, they advanced while we struggled to respond, limited by fuel shortages and vehicle breakdowns. The logistics balance had reversed completely. I calculate that without American truck deliveries, Soviet forces would have retained the limited mobility characteristic of 1941-42. Their offensives would have stalled sooner. Our defensive operations would have been more manageable. The war might have stabilized into stalemate. The American trucks specifically, not tanks or aircraft, but simple transport trucks, proved decisive. They enabled Soviet operational depth, sustained offensive tempo, and rapid force concentration. These were the capabilities Napoleon's Grande Armée lacked. American industry provided them to Stalin's forces, and that made all the difference. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, in his 1951 memoir Panzer Leader, reflected specifically on the Studebaker truck's impact. The Studebaker US6 was not a weapon system that killed German soldiers directly. It was something far more dangerous, a logistics enabler that allowed the Red Army to project power across the vast distances of the Eastern Front. German intelligence had assured us the Soviets lacked strategic mobility. We believed they could defend but not conduct sustained offensives. The American trucks destroyed this assumption. Soviet forces could now concentrate, advance, redeploy, and sustain operations with efficiency we couldn't counter. I saw these trucks everywhere in 1944-45, towing artillery, carrying infantry, delivering supplies. They were more reliable than our own vehicles, Soviet drivers loved them. The trucks functioned in Russian winter conditions that destroyed our vehicles. This was American engineering solving Soviet logistics problems we had counted on to limit their effectiveness. If someone had told me in 1940 that American trucks would be the decisive weapon of the Eastern Front, I would have laughed. After 5 years of combat, I understood. The war's outcome was determined not by tactical brilliance, but by logistics capacity. The side that could move and supply forces most effectively would win. American trucks gave the Soviets that advantage. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, in his 1969 memoir, Reminiscences and Reflections, provided the definitive Soviet perspective on American trucks. When people ask how we won the war, they expect answers about battles and weapons. The truth is more prosaic. We won because we could move and supply forces effectively. American trucks made this possible. In 1941, most Red Army units moved on foot, supplied by horse-drawn wagons. This limited our operational responses. We couldn't concentrate forces quickly or sustain offensives beyond railways. The Germans exploited this weakness ruthlessly. By 1943, American Studebaker trucks had transformed our capabilities. We could move divisions hundreds of kilometers in days. Artillery could redeploy rapidly. Supplies reached advancing forces reliably. The operational mobility Napoleon lacked in 1812, we possessed in 1943, thanks to American industrial support. The Germans studied Napoleon's failure but didn't realize we had solved his logistics problems. They expected to face an enemy as immobile as Napoleon's Russia. Instead, they faced an enemy whose logistics rivaled their own, enabled by American production they couldn't match or interdict. The Studebaker truck was worth its weight in gold. Soviet drivers worshipped these vehicles. Maintenance was simple, reliability was exceptional. They functioned in temperatures that stopped German vehicles. They carried loads our trucks couldn't handle. They were, quite simply, the best trucks in the war. Without American trucks, our offensives would have stalled. We couldn't have maintained the operational tempo that drove Germany from our territory. The liberation of Eastern Europe, the drive to Berlin, all required logistics capacity that only American trucks provided. This is the truth that historians sometimes miss focusing on tanks and aircraft. The humble truck won the Eastern Front. In 1986, the Soviet government authorized limited public acknowledgement of Lend-Lease contributions. Previously, Soviet historiography had minimized American aid, crediting victory to Soviet heroism and industrial capacity. The new openness allowed veterans to discuss American equipment publicly. Vasily Yakubovsky, a former tank officer who became a Soviet marshal, stated in a 1987 interview, "Every Soviet officer knew about the American trucks. We called them Studers. They were more valuable than gold. When a unit received Studebakers, morale improved immediately because everyone knew these trucks wouldn't break down. The official history ignored them, but we veterans remember clearly. Without American trucks, we would still have won eventually. Soviet determination was unbreakable, but the victory would have taken years longer and cost millions more lives. The Studebaker truck shortened the war. This was American contribution to defeating fascism." Modern historical analysis confirms these assessments. Dr. Boris Sokolov, Russian military historian, calculated in his 2012 study that American trucks effectively doubled Soviet logistics capacity between 1942 and 1945. His research demonstrated that Soviet offensives with primarily American truck logistics, 1943-45, advanced 50% faster than offensives with primarily Soviet horse transport, 1941-42. American trucks increased Soviet artillery effectiveness by 300% through improved ammunition supply. Operational losses decreased 40% when forces used American rather than Soviet vehicles, and the strategic mobility enabling deep operations doctrine was primarily American provided. Dr. Sokolov concluded, German generals who studied Napoleon's logistics failure ironically created similar failures in their own forces, while their enemy solved logistics problems through American industrial support. The Germans planned meticulously for the campaign they expected, While remaining blind to the campaign, they would actually fight. The United States Army's official history of Lend-Lease, published in 1962, addressed the Eastern Front specifically. While Soviet courage and German overextension were critical factors in German defeat, American logistics support provided the operational enabler that transformed Soviet potential into Soviet victory. The 400,000-plus trucks represented the largest single transfer of military mobility in history. This contribution proved decisive. At the Russian Military Museum in Moscow, a permanent exhibit displays a Studebaker US6 truck, one of the few surviving examples. The placard notes, "American Lend-Lease trucks provided the Red Army with logistics capability that enabled offensive operations from 1943-1945. These vehicles represented Allied cooperation that proved essential to victory." December 18, 1940. The Map Room at Wolfschanze. Generaloberst Franz Halder studied Napoleon's routes across Russia, confident that German mechanization would avoid 19th century logistics failures. Soviet logistics appeared hopelessly primitive, horse-drawn, inefficient, vulnerable. German motorized forces would advance faster than Soviets could respond. The campaign would end before winter. The lessons of 1812 had been learned and applied. By December 1943, exactly 3 years later, Halder's successor, Generaloberst Kurt Seitzler, faced a very different reality. Soviet forces, supplied by hundreds of thousands of American trucks, were advancing with operational mobility German forces couldn't match. The primitive logistics of 1941 had been transformed by American industrial support that German planners never anticipated and couldn't counter. The generals who studied Napoleon's failure never imagined Americans would solve Russia's logistics problems with 400,000 trucks. They prepared meticulously for the campaign they expected, Germany's mechanized forces against Soviet primitiveness. They never anticipated the campaign they faced, increasing German logistics breakdown against Soviet mobility enabled by American industrial power. The Studebaker US6 trucks that German intelligence dismissed in 1942 became the vehicles that carried the Red Army to Berlin in 1945. These simple, rugged, mass-produced American trucks proved more decisive than any exotic weapon system. They enabled Soviet operational doctrine, sustained offensive tempo, and provided the logistics capacity that Napoleon's army lacked, and German forces couldn't counter. The lesson German generals learned too late was that studying historical failures without understanding changing technological and industrial contexts created dangerous blindness. Napoleon's logistics failed because 19th century supply systems couldn't support armies across Russian distances. That same failure didn't constrain 20th century Soviet forces because American factories provided the trucks that made modern logistics possible. Generaloberst Franz Halder spent post-war years reflecting on Barbarossa's failure. In a 1961 interview shortly before his death, he made his final assessment. "We studied history carefully. We learned Napoleon's lessons. We planned meticulously. But we made the fundamental error of assuming the enemy we faced in 1941 would remain unchanged throughout the war. We never imagined American industrial power would transform Soviet capabilities so completely. Those trucks, hundreds of thousands of American trucks, gave Stalin's forces the mobility Napoleon never possessed. We prepared to fight Russia's 1941 army. By 1943, we faced Russia's army equipped with American logistics. Against that combination, all our careful planning proved worthless. History's lesson wasn't that Russia's vastness defeated invaders. The lesson was that Russia's vastness required logistics capacity to overcome. Napoleon lacked it. We initially possessed it but couldn't sustain it. The Soviets acquired it through American support. That made all the difference.